Welcome, everyone. Today we're here to do something that perhaps you've always wanted to do. We're going to take a trip to the Roman Ghetto. The Roman Ghetto is a place that you have heard about, maybe you visited, or you think you visited. In fact, you haven't visited it at all. You may have visited the area of the Roman Ghetto. Before that, you may not even known that there are Jews in Italy. Oh, you may have read about it, but you don't actually know about it. The first time I met an Italian Jew, I couldn't guess the person was from Italy. Because, well, we know Jews in Germany, Poland, Spain, Italy? Well, yes, Italy. Because, as Rabbeinu Tam said, Ki mi bari tetzei Torah v'devar Elohim mi otranto. These are cities in the far south of Italy, and this is in the early Middle Ages. And indeed, the Jewish learning went up the Italian peninsula, probably into Lyon, and then into the Rhineland, following merchant routes in the early Middle Ages. But that's for another talk. I even once traced it. The map you're looking at is a map of Rome itself, of central Rome. And you can see with the Saman, with the cursor here, this island. Now, the island is of current interest because during World War II, it has a hospital run by monks, and they hid hundreds of Jews in the basement of the island. But right across from the island, in a little bit of an area that I'm tracing here, and it's very small, very, very small area, about 7 acres, was the ghetto. I say was because in the 1890s, when the ghetto no longer existed as a separate institution, it was totally destroyed. It was destroyed because there was no choice but to destroy it. It was a health hazard. How people had managed to live there is impossible to know. There are buildings on the side of it. There's a building on the street called the Portico de Ottavia, the Octavio's portico. You can go and see it today. It's an ancient structure. The building was a monastery or a convent in the late 15th century, and people lived there and Jews lived there. But the ghetto itself is a very small area. And in this ghetto lived up to 4,000 people. It's rather hard to believe. I know by today's standards, if you look at Manhattan and the how dense the population is there, but it isn't the same thing. It's not the same thing without electricity, without modern plumbing and running water and all kinds of things like that. So let's look at these Jews, and I want to do it in 2 sections. One, this first talk I'm calling The Ghetto from Without. That is, how did the ghetto begin? How did the Jews get into the ghetto? How is it that they lived there? How were the relations with the outside world? The second talk, for the next projection of it, the second talk will deal with the ghetto from within, Jewish life itself. How is it organized? But first, let's look at the ghetto from without. First of all, what was the situation? When was the ghetto erected? It was erected, there's a specific date. July the 14th, July the 13th, people debate this date, the 17th of 1555, when Pope Paul IV inaugurated it. Now, I will get to that inauguration in just a moment, but do know that that before the Roman ghetto was established, there was another one, and it was in Venice, and that was in 1516. But what was the state of Jewish life in all of Europe by this time? Well, if we go to Western Europe, Spain, of course, the Jews had been expelled in 1492, and that, of course, includes the Jews of Sicily, who were under the rule of the Crown of Aragon, and by the 1540s, they'd been expelled from all of southern Italy. Then there were Jews who were expelled from France, as we know, from England. German communities were smaller, but bit by bit from the time of the Black Death in 1348, there were attacks, expulsions, whatever, so there were very few Jews left. The great Polish Jewish diaspora, that didn't really begin until the 16th century, and then, of course, there were Jews in Turkey and in Greece. But Europe itself, Western Europe itself, was really empty of Jews except for the northern part of Italy. Now, Jews had always traded in Venice, but they didn't live there. They didn't live there because the Venetians considered their city pure. It was pure unto God. It was unique, the Venetian concept. It was half secular even, which is a term I'd never use for the Middle Ages and until far in the Renaissance. It was half secular, and it was also with a concept of being a very special place. Well, very special places are not supposed to be contaminated. And they're not supposed to be contaminated in particular by Jews, because Jews were always perceived as a contaminant. Why should that be? Well, if we had 3 or 4 lessons, we could go back to Paul in the Epistle to the Romans, Paul in Galatians in particular, and there we would see a notion that a Christian is not supposed to have contact with impure things. Because if the Christian does have contact with impure things, then the Christian, him or herself, becomes completely polluted. In the same way that one might talk about a ritual pollution. Indeed, it begins with ritual pollution. Who can belong, who can partake of the sacrifice? The sacrifice, of course, for Christians was the Eucharist. Only those who are pure and uncontaminated. Jews, as the words of John Chrysostom at the end of the 4th century, Jews are dogs. Jews were once the children of God, now they're dogs. We Christians who were once the dogs are now the children. And this is an idea which continues. There's even a game played by children in Chile today, which is, they say, ¿Quien robó el pane del horno? Who stole the bread from the oven? And the response is el perro judío, the Jewish dog, the Jewish dog. Now this is really an accusation of attacking the host on the part of Jews. So this notion, which again, I very, very briefly, and I've written about it elsewhere, they've even written a book called Jewish Dogs. This notion is fundamental. We don't want Jews polluting our society. And in 1516, in Venice, they found a solution. They put the Jews in a place called the Ghetto. The name pre-exists. It's not that there was a place and then it was called the Ghetto. It was probably because at one time they used the Ghetto as a place to cast cannons, copper for cannons. It's a small island way out in the corner. If you've ever been to Venice, you know that it's near the train station, way out really at the end of the city, certainly nothing to do. And they never really let the Jews settle there permanently. It was always 5 years, 5 years, 5 years. But Venice was Venice because of the way it was, and it never really threatened Jewish existence. Something else happened, though. Something else happened in Rome. What happened in Rome was a notion that the Jews had to be converted. Well, you say, well, the church always wanted to convert the Jews. Yes, but quietly, on a low burner. Yes, we look forward to their conversion at the end of days, said Paul. Romans 11. It's fundamental. Jews have a right to live in Christian society. Absolute, not to be disturbed, says the doctrine of the Catholic Church. And the popes actually observed that doctrine over the years. But live doesn't mean that they can just walk around and do whatever. But not only that, suddenly in the 16th century, the church is challenged. It's challenged on 2 fronts. First, the start of Protestantism, which challenged the church's doctrines, and certainly the sanctity in place of the Pope, that it does. But apart from that, the church is challenged because kings are declaring themselves to be the heads of churches, even if they remain Catholics. The most prominent example is something that some of you may have seen yesterday. The King of England has merum ecclesiastum. He is the head of the church. He is actually the head of the church in England. And the church calls itself a Catholic church. So that the popes are really scared, and they start to feel that the end of days is upon them. So let's do something to convert the Jews. And indeed, a lot of writing anticipates the Ghetto. And for instance, in 1513, two monks wrote a note to the Pope, who was Leo X, and they said, perhaps you'll be able to make progress with the Jews. I'm reading short selections. If they are led to the faith by the blandishments of the Spirit and by all offices of humanity. However, if so led they have not wished to convert on account of their stiff-necked perfidy, as Jews are always pictured, they should be handled with bitter and harsh measures. Not because you wish to harm them, for no one should be forced to the faith. That's a fundamental doctrine, which we'll see gets played with. But so seeing those of them who have wished to convert to be treated caressingly, they themselves will convert. But if they don't, we should treat them with threats and pious lashes. Pious, what is a pious lash? Well, for the Latinists among you, it's piis verberibus. Where did that term come from? It came from the Pope Gregory the Great at the end of the 6th century. Now, he wasn't talking about you Jews when he mentioned that. Piis verberibus, he said, if someone committed a sin and they do not repent from this sin, then they should be treated with piis verberibus, pious lashes, and we will make them convert. So that an idea is growing up that we have to do something. The world is changing, and we have to bring closer the end of days, and the way that we're going to do it is by trying to really convert the Jews. First, we'll try easily, which you might say they did for a while, but then we're going to do it with force, with pious lashes. And indeed, this is backed up. I bring you another text from somebody, a Jesuit from 1555, and they have added something else to this idea of converting the Jews. Not only to pressure them, but we want to get rid of their literature. And he writes, his name is Francisco de Torres. He says, what is particularly necessary for the salvation of the Jews, indeed for the glory of Christ, I will state boldly. If you do not interdict, refuse to the Jews all the remaining commentaries of the Jewish tradition, then it is all in vain. For when that wisdom, or rather the insanity of their traditions, of the Jewish fables and of commentaries, you may, some of you have known that the Talmud was attacked already in the 13th century. When they've been blotted from memory, they will easily understand the mysteries of Christ. And the most famous of all, non alpharetur sceptrum de Juda, which you all know as Lo Yasur Shevet mi Yuda ad Yavo Shilo. He's taken it from there. And this is something that's very important. Doctrine is growing not only of conversion, but doctrine is also solidifying. Actually, it's been there all the time. The Jews are not to exercise any kind of power. Now, in the Middle Ages, this doctrine was there. In fact, it's even in late Roman Christian law. The Jews are not to hold office. Indeed, this continues, and were this another talk, I would try to explain how it continues. The last time I saw it almost explicitly mentioned was in 1929, because it gets to the notion of, is it legitimate for Jews to exercise sovereignty in the state of Israel? But I won't go into that today. It's just that it continues the notion that Jews are not to have political power. Well, how are they not to have political power? Aren't Jews, Jewish communities, autonomous? Don't they run themselves autonomously? And the answer is no. People have thought they did, but they never did, because they never had the power to act as judges on their own. A judge of what's called primary jurisdiction. That is, if you commit in Israel a crime, you hit someone, you will go to Beit Mishpat Shalom, if I'm not wrong. You won't go to you won't go to a traffic court, and the judges have primary jurisdiction. Well, Jews don't have primary jurisdiction. Their literature is bad. They have to be pressed. What to do? How do we resolve this? We resolve this by Pope Paul IV in the year 1555, and what he says is that I'm going to put the Jews into a ghetto. I'm going to take the Jews, he doesn't use the word ghetto, by the way, he calls it a Claustrum, a Serraglio. Some of you know the word Serraglio probably when we think about the Sultan in Turkey. But no, Serraglio is a good Latin word, Italian word, and that is what they called it. In 1555, in July of 1555, the Pope says and announces, I'm going to put all the Jews into a ghetto. I'm going to into this Claustrum. I'm going to close them up. I'm going to make sure they have no power. I'm going to pressure them. I'm going to continue attacking their literature. In fact, in the year 1553, just 2 years before, the Inquisition had burned the Talmud in Rome. This is the first time that the Talmud was burned in Rome. People think, oh, the 13th century, they burned Talmuds in France. Yes, they did it in Paris, but nowhere else, actually. Nowhere else. Afterwards, Jewish literature was attacked as blasphemous and improper and really confusing the Jews, or the idea was half of it is fake, half of it isn't the real rabbinic tradition, it's false, it has to be removed, and the other half of it is the rabbis who didn't want to say so, really recognizing that Jesus is the Messiah. But again, that is another topic on its own. A third thing that occurred in Rome before the ghetto in 1543 was the establishment of a house of converts. That is, a place where people who said they're going to convert, or wanted to convert, or maybe not so wanted but somehow wound up there, and we'll get to that a little later on, will be taught and become Christians and will be baptized. This is what the goal is, and Paul IV does it. And let's see how he does it and exactly what he says. This is the opening of the bull. Now, we have to read papal bulls very carefully. People jump at the opening sentences and they read them, and they read them as really being what the bull is about. It's usually a theological discussion, which they may turn around and say, no, we don't do it that way. But he begins, where it is absurd and improper that Jews whose own guilt has condemned them to perpetual servitude. Perpetual servitude is a term which began in the year, if I'm not wrong, 1203, the Pope Innocent III, or 1205, probably 1205, and he said that Jews have to live in a state of perpetual servitude. That doesn't mean they're slaves. It means they have to observe all the canons which limit them. Well, they're under the status of perpetual servitude. But the Jews, under the pretext that Christian piety receives them and tolerates their presence, Christian piety being caritas, the fundamental piety, the fundamental justice of the world, and tolerates. Tolerates is always a bad translation, doesn't mean put up with them, it means gives them privileges. Tolerare in Latin means to give privilege. But the Jews have been ingrates to Christians. They attempt to exchange the obedience they owe to Christians for dominion over them. And whereas it has lately come to our notice that these in our own dear city of Rome and other cities, possessions and territories, because remember, the Pope is not just sitting in the Vatican the way he does today, he is the ruler of all of central Italy. And this is something that continued until the year 1870 and the founding of the Italian Republic, because just as the ghetto has a precise beginning date of July of 1555, it has a precise ending date, September the 20th of 1870, when the Pope is deprived of all his physical possessions, closed up in the Vatican, and for about 70 years casts curses on all the rulers of Rome and the Italian Republic. Well, all the Jews there, they have erupted into insolence, presuming not only to dwell side by side with Christians and near their churches, with no distinction in clothing that would separate them, because Jews are supposed to wear special clothing, and to erect homes in the more notable sections and streets of the city's possessions and territories, and to buy land, to have wet nurses, servant girls, and other hired servants that are Christians, and to perpetuate many things in contempt of the Christian name. Well, none of these Jews are supposed to have there are canon laws. People say, well, one pope gave this law, one pope gave another. But there is something called canon law. It's a fixed body of law. One can see it developing. It's highly developed by the 10th century. People who say, oh, in the early Middle Ages it was okay for Jews, that's, excuse me, nonsense. It wasn't okay. These laws were all there. The question was, were these laws being observed? Were Jews being forced to convert? In many places they were, and so on and so forth. Well, they are not supposed to have, the law says, they're not supposed to have wet nurses, they're not supposed to have servants. Essentially, they're not supposed to lord it over Christians in any way, shape, or form. So, he said, if that's the case, and not only that, but with due consideration, the Jews were behaving awfully, he says, for the tolerance that the Roman Church extends to the Jews, in testimony of the Christian faith. That is, Paul said, in Romans chapters 9 to 11, we have to live with the Jews, and toward the goal that the Jews, led by the piety and kindness of the apostolic see, should at length recognize their errors and make all haste to arrive at the true light of the Catholic faith. That's why we tolerate Jews. Toward the goal, ad hoc ut in Latin. If you know Latin, it's very strong. We tolerate them ad hoc ut to this very end, that the Jews, led by the kindness, should at length recognize their errors and convert. That's where he's going. Now, people will say, but the church always wanted it. It always wanted it, yes, but it never established policy so forceful and so directly. We can see in texts leading up to this, moving toward this in the 50 or 60 years, but mostly in the 30 years before 1555, but nothing like this. So, what he's going to now say is that therefore, desiring to do this thing, we will make Jews to live solely in one and the same place. Only that. There is the establishment of the Roman ghetto. He then goes on with a long list of prohibitions. Now, these prohibitions, you can actually find them in Venice too, but none of it comes after an opening, what's called a proemium. None of it comes after an opening which says a church is out to convert the Jews. The church desires to convert the Jews. Converting the Jews becomes a central thing. And indeed it does become a central thing. At first the hope is it's going to be a mass conversion. Of course it never happens. But it doesn't mean they gave up. It doesn't mean the Jews are forced to listen to sermons, which, by the way, up to this point was canonically illegal, but they found a way to do it anyway. It doesn't. It means that when we have a baptismal ceremony, we're going to do the most amazing of baptismal ceremonies. We're going to make it something that adds to the glory of the church. We are going to truly become a church which reflects its honor, as it properly should, in the shadow of the Jews. There's nothing really new in that, by the way. It's in Paul in the Romans. If you want to know the doctrine of the church to Jews, you read Paul in the Epistle to the Romans, chapters 9 to 11. The Jews are no longer the children. The Jews are those who once were the children of God. The real descendants are the spiritual descendants. And who determines who the spiritual descendants are? Well, the church, by virtue of baptizing people. If you're baptized, your soul is saved. If you're not baptized, your soul is not saved. And the church is now setting out with a force, with a vigor to do so, because the church has never been challenged before this way. Oh, there have been breakaways, there have been heretics, there have been difficulties. But there's never been anything like what happens from the beginning of the 16th century with Martin Luther, and it's going to get worse. It's going to get worse because, as we'll come to see, secular rulers, including Catholic ones, are going to say, wait a minute, we don't want to be under the thumb of the church. And in particular, and I'll get back to this too, I believe, in particular, we don't want the church to have control of marriage. One of the signs of a secular state is the existence of obligatory civil marriage. if you go to a country like Argentina today, which has an official Catholic religion, not too many people there know it, but they have an official Catholic religion, you can't get married in a church until you've had a separate civil ceremony conducted by somebody else. That's the sign of a modern state. Well, the church erupts over all this and doesn't want it. And so it wants the Jews to live solely in a place of the ghetto. How are they going to achieve this? Well, we read before these notions of converting Jews and bringing them the notion of restraining Jews, the notion of the pious lashes, the notion of removing their books. And that's what's going to happen. The rest of this text here, it's long, I won't give it to you. The rest of the text, you can find it. It's published in a couple of places. There are all kinds of restrictions. Jews can't move. Jews are limited in their economic activities. They may not in particular deal in foodstuffs. Well, this is important because until this time, a lot of Jews in Rome dealt with food. They were wholesale food dealers, and this is going to stop them there. It usually looks like the Pope says all they can deal with is mending and old clothing, which in large part Jews wound up doing, but the actual text doesn't really say that. Very restricted kind of thing. And to get a basis for this, a man named Marquardus de Susanis, who was a lawyer and a jurist in the town of Udine. Udine is way up near Venice in Italy, but his book, which I will now mention, called Concerning Jews and Other Infidels, De Judaeis et Aliis Infidelibus, this book, which appeared in 1558, comes in order to show the status of Jews in all law. In all law. What does it mean, in all law? There is something called jus commune, common law. Don't confuse it with British common law. It's Roman law. Ancient Roman law, which has been changed and adapted for the Middle Ages, but it's a Roman law that's a Christian Roman law. The prohibition of Jews holding public offices in Christian Roman law. Then there's canon law, which I said developed organically, really, from the 6th, 7th, 8th century onward. It's been codified. It's going to be recodified, in fact, in 1584. And the canon law has many, many rules concerning the behavior and regulation of Jews. And De Sanis brings all of this. And then in the middle of it, his book is 300 pages. Anyone wanting to read some Latin for a long time, get a copy of De Susanis. It's online, by the way, very easy. And you'll see that in the middle, he suddenly talks about why Christianity is truth and why the Jews have to do it. Here is the blueprint. Using strong restriction and limitations, they're going to convert the Jews. You say to yourself, can they be serious? Well, they were. This is an age of belief. And they really thought they would do it. And bit by bit, they had a little success. Indeed, they had one tremendous success with a family called the Korkos. And we'll come back to another Korkos with whom they did not have success. But they had great success with this Korkos family, which changed its name to Boncompagni, thanks to the patron who was present at the baptism. And they became one of the richest families in Rome, and one of their descendants, Gregorio, about 100 years later, was a major preacher to Roman Jews. He left, as we know from a book which just came out by Emily Nicholson, we know of 27 or 28 sermons that this person issued because it was so important. And so here we have this enormous change in Roman Jewish life, which is to bring about the existence of a ghetto to close the Jews in. Now, where were they closing? What were they doing? How were they closing the Jews in? As you saw all these clauses there. Well, what was the ghetto? What was it like? At first, the Jews react by saying, oh, the Pope just wants us to live in a single place. I don't know how serious it is, how seriously it was meant, because we know of what was going on in Rome and among the Jewish community, and this will be fundamental for the second talk later on. We know what they were doing because the Jews themselves left records. They left records through a very interesting institution, to which I will talk about a little more later, called the Jewish notaries, the notai hebrei. A notary, as many of you know, certainly from living in Israel, is almost a lawyer. It's not like in the United States, say, where you go to every office has a notary who just signals through a seal that you signed the document in the notary's presence. No, a notary is much more thing. And we have a very special institution of Jews in Rome who leave us a great deal of information about what goes on. And indeed, one of the things they tell us in one of their texts is that in 1569, the text comes from 1588, in which the Jews say, we were placed in nostro ghet. Now somebody listening may say, wait a minute, what's this ghet? Well, I think that that's exactly what they intended. Nostro ghet in the sense of, remember they're writing Italian, and this I didn't mention and I failed to mention. One of the reasons it's so shocking for the Jews of Rome is that unlike any place else, how could I have skipped this? Any place else in Europe, really, Jews are not immigrants. Jews go to Germany, they've immigrated from somewhere. They go to maybe there were some Jews at the end of the Roman Empire in Gaul, yes. In Spain, yes, but the Jews have been expelled. But in Italy, the Jews have been there since before Julius Caesar. Indeed, Yochanan Levi, the great historian, claimed they were among Julius Caesar's political companions, his supporters. Cicero hated them. Tacitus, the historian, hated them. Jews have been there as long as anybody else. They're Italians. They didn't have to learn Italian. Italian was their native language. Of course, they're not an Italian that was spoken. They create a bit of a dialect with it, and I'll get to that. But Jews are as Roman as they're Jewish, and as Jewish as they're Roman. And so the whole thing kind of shakes up a coexistence that's been on for years and years and years. The Jews say, what's this with the Pope? The Pope has always been malleable. There have always been rules. We've had to do this or that sometimes, but we always got along very well. We get along with the Romans very well. It's not always simple, and we'll get to that, but we get along. Suddenly, they're closed in, and they don't quite understand. And finally, in 1588, after the Jewish population grows, and it's clear that the Pope has to make a choice, one of which is to allow Jews to live outside the ghetto. He makes a choice by expanding the size of the ghetto, bringing it down to the river. And I'll get to that right away. He brings it down to the river, which is terrible because it floods in the spring. And the Jews say, we are in nostro ghet. What's a ghet? Certificate of divorce, of course. Libellum repudii in Latin, if you want. It is a document which is given to whom? To the divorced wife to hold. The Jews say we are the divorced wife in this situation. We have been treated wrongly, and we will not forget this. Well, let's look at the ghetto itself from this period, but let me read you part of a description which comes from the famous historian Gregorovius at the end of the 18th century, the middle of the 19th century. He wrote, and I'll show you these pictures. You can see the squalor of the housing. You see how Jews are working out. They're actually working outside or living outside. Here is the flood of the Tiber River going right up to the ghetto. You see how unsanitary the buildings are. This actually is from a more modern part of the ghetto that was added in the 19th century. But here is much more what it's like. I mean, again, this is, you can see the woman mending. The Jews were experts at what used to be called invisible mending, where they could fix something up and you wouldn't know that it had been ruined or destroyed. Again, you see what it's like, places falling apart. This arch actually is going into the fish stall, the fish market, which was right next to the ghetto, and the fish sellers used to give the Jews in the ghetto a lot of trouble. Well, there's some artichokes, but we'll get to them in the next talk. Listen to Gregorovius. The ghetto is reached either from the city by way of the theater of Marcellus and the porticus of Octavia through the Via Savelli. Again, you go to Rome, you'll see it immediately. It dominates what used to be the main street, which has now become a food circus, most unfortunately. This affords a most striking view of ancient medieval Rome, a picture so strange and enchanting as can be hardly paralleled in this city of memories. Directly ahead are the houses, the ghetto houses in a row, tower-like masses of bizarre design, with numerous flower pots in the windows and countless household utensils hanging on the walls. The rows ascend from the river's edge and its dismal billows wash against the walls. It is only a few steps from the bridge to the ghetto, which is whose level is extremely low, the ghetto's level. When I first visited, the Tiber had overflowed its banks, and its yellow flood streamed through the Fiumara, the lowest, the Fiume's river, the lowest of the ghetto streets, the foundation of whose houses serve as a quay to hold the river in its course. The flood reached up as far as the porticus of the Ottavio. The physiognomy of the ghetto environment struck me as penetrating the atmosphere with gloomy imaginings. The darkened aura of the portico of Ottavia, its ruined and blackened arches gaping upon the stinking pescara, the fish market, the crowded and dark fish market, where the Jews' fasting fare is laid out on slabs. Well, I could go on with this thing, but I think that here I've really read enough of it to give you an idea of what the ghetto became. This was after, remember, 1850 was founded in 1550. That tells us, of course, that the ghetto existed throughout all this time. The Jews became more and more weak. Indeed, up till the year 1682, they had actually managed decently to survive economically because a great deal of lending was allowed to take place. There were 60 or 70 Jewish lenders. They called them bankers, but believe me, these people weren't bankers. They were more like pawn shop dealers. These people in this situation, they gave a lot of work to people because they existed, and they kept the ghetto going. We know what a blow it was when the banks were closed, because the Jews tell us so in their own documentation. They appeal to the Pope. They say, for heaven's sakes, reopen it. Nobody's eating anything anymore. And this has become a truly difficult situation for them. What is more, they begin to deal with another institution. The popes, that is. The institution is one called that of offering. What do I mean by offering? More proper term would be oblation, but they use offrire, to offer. It means that if I convert and I have a little sister, I can offer her to the church. Yes, offer her to the church. If I am a parent and I convert, and my spouse doesn't matter. I can offer a child to the church. If I claim that I was engaged to somebody, and not just an erusin, but a kiddushin, actually a kiddushin, and we'll get to that why it would be a kiddushin without the marriage yet, but this is Rome, we'll see it. If I have a kiddushin, I can offer the person to the church. Where do the limits stop? Well, they keep expanding over the years and over the years and over the years till they get to the point that a brother-in-law can offer a niece or a nephew. In other words, the church is in a very difficult position. It needs these conversions. It wants these conversions. It's not getting enough of them. And so it's willing to do a lot of things in order to get them. It's even willing to force the heads of the community, called factori, factors, the three factori, the mimunim in Hebrew, of the community, to bring and present people to the house of converts, where they will be pressured, they will be put into tremendous problems, and they will be practically forced to baptize. Now, if it's actually a child or a wife, they can hold you up to 40 days. And they do. And most people break down. And this has been studied at great length, really. If you're only a spouse or a presumptive spouse, it's only 12 days. In one case, of a woman named Anna del Monte, don't confuse that with fruit companies. Del Monte is listed in Hebrew in the registers of the community as Minhahar. Some of you may know that's Montpellier in France. Anna del Monte, in 1749, was accused of being, not accused, she was said by someone who said he was her fiancé, actually a poor Jew, and she was from a rather reasonably well-to-do family, because there were such, especially in the 18th century, Jews started to deal in spices. She came from a reasonably well-to-do family, and this poor Jew said they had been engaged, a kiddushin, and therefore he could offer her to the house of converts. Well, Anna del Monte got out of the house of converts, and she stayed a Jew. She remained a Jew, and she wrote some notes, which sort of became like a diary. And then her brother later on, Tranquillo del Monte, improved this diary and worked it. And you can see it by reading it. It's a diary which the whole translation of which from Italian to English I've published in a book called Anna and Tranquillo. Her brother is Tranquillo, who is also a community head. But it also has to deal with the nature of Jewish life in Rome at this time. But Anna and Tranquillo works this up, and when you read the diary, which Academia EDU actually has taken and put online, I don't know how they got it to do it, but they did. Anyway, this diary, it's so constructed. You watch how this woman day by day is pressured more and more and more. I would like to read part of it to you. Without warning, on the 20th of April, 1749, at the end of the Passover festival, I was kidnapped and taken away by force, thanks to a false denunciation made against my family by a scoundrel. She calls him a rasha. I was totally innocent, but he tricked the vice-regent, that's the man who runs the city for the Pope, into issuing an order that which straight away the sheriff, the Bargello, and his men burst into my house and seized me. They sandwiched me in between them with their pistols drawn. They didn't even give me the courtesy of the time to change my clothing or to say a word to my mother and father, as though I were a horse, slapping me around and paying no attention to people's rank or even their state of health. They snapped me up like a buffoon in such haste that I still had on my kitchen dress. When my father tried to speak me, they shoved a pistol into his face. Only God saved his life. I was pushed into a carriage, and I was whisked away and taken to the house of converts until a prioress, the head of the convent, came to tell me, she was herself probably a convert, to pray to God that I be illuminated, to be contrite and convert. I responded boldly and with pluck that I had already been illuminated, and I had no intention of being deceived to desert the religion into which I was born. And I I prayed and committed myself to remain a Jew. I did not want them, she says, rubare l'anima. Somebody tried to translate this as to steal my free will. Well, you can't steal free will. It's something innate in you. But you can quash it. You can prevent it from living. She said, no, my free will is to remain a Jew. And let me read just one more little section from this thing. The diary itself, which was first edited in the Italian by the late Professor Yosef Baruch Sermonetta, some by people listening may have known this great man. Well, the diary, which probably circulated only handwritten because it's so dangerous, the things it says about the priests, comes with a story that goes like this, and actually this repeats for many times. She said, a priest came into the room, and he was wild and mad, and he took something which he called the crown, and he passed it again and again over my face and head, saying, "This is the chain that will bind your heart to our faith, and this is the water which I now pour upon you a second time, which is the power to smother the infernal fire that has been prepared for all Jews. There is no way to make it grow old other than by accepting this holy water with love." He repeated this performance nearly 20 times. Then he got down on his knees and began to pray, saying, "I pray for you to throw off the dark clouds that throw shadows on your mind and intellect in the darkness of belief." I, hearing these words, began to fear greatly and shout bitterly, crying with my eyes facing heavenward. I prayed to God that he give me the strength and save me from the hands of this rapacious, infernal, monstrous bear who is trying to steal my soul and rob me of my essence by force. Well, Anna got out. And believe it or not, there were actually people who helped him. There's something rather strange that was not strange that's going on in the ghetto that we have to look at. And with this, I'm going to bring this talk to a close. This is just really what I brought you is a true Vorspeise of things. There was a lawyer named Carlo Luti. Carlo Luti had represented the Jews a number of times. He was not Jewish. And he was furious at this kind of behavior. He was furious at this kind of behavior because, remember, this is 1749. This is already the Enlightenment. People are talking about people having rights which have nothing to do with religion. And he attacks the Pope Benedict XIV. Benedict XIV had encapsulated all this material that I talked about, who could offer baptism and who could offer what, into a bull called Postremo Mense in the last month. Now, Benedict XIV actually was a very, very educated person. This was not some brute. He even corresponded with Montesquieu. We're not talking about somebody who doesn't know anything. And yet, to convert, to save the church was the most important thing for him. And he writes, and he knows that he's stretching the issues with his notion that we do things, as he put it, for favor fide, for the sake of the faith. And he said, it's like an extra weight, the sopra carico. And Luti says to him, this is nonsense. This is exceeding all papal right and rule. This is, effectively, he says, this is chutzpah. I won't read Luti to you, but Luti wrote a 150-page tract denouncing the Pope for this kind of thing. In other words, the ghetto is running onto a very difficult time. We have the church still trying to glorify itself. We have the church still trying to convert all the Jews. The church holding the Jews in the ghetto this way. The Jews trying somehow or other to survive, and we'll see in the next talk how they survive from within. We have Christians who are complaining. They know what's going on in the outside world, and it grows and it grows. And life gets really tight. In 1775, the Pope Pius VI goes really crazy. He says, no, Jews can't have wet nurses anymore. But there are no Jewish wet nurses because Jewish women basically nurse their own children. He says you can't have laundry people come in to take the clothing out of the ghetto, but the ghetto doesn't have enough water. We can't remove garbage from the ghetto. And the ghetto had worked very hard. We have documents of the Jews working to fix a sewer system in the ghetto. They had a real sewer system. The man is actually trying to strangle the Jews in the way of De Torres, in the way of Quirine Justiniani, in their letter to Leo X. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. The Jews are really struggling for a while. It doesn't work because Napoleon comes in 1797. And at that point, everything changes for a brief time. For a brief time only, because when Napoleon goes, when then it goes the second time actually, the ghetto is restored, things are still bad. We still have pressure putting on. And we don't know how long this would have lasted if it had not been for, of all things, the Mortara case. The famous Mortara case, the kidnapping of Edgar Mortaro, where we know that Europe was so angry with the Pope that they removed the support it was giving him, and the Italian kingdom came in and conquered, and as I said, ended the ghetto, just like that, on the same day that the Italian Republic was formed. But that doesn't mean that the church gave up its ideas. My time is up, and I'm not going to take time to read to you from an encyclical issued in 1885 by Pope Leo XIII. Because in that encyclical, he reprises the doctrines of the church which say there are certain things which belong only to religion, like marriage. The state must accept religious rule and religious control. Things still continue very much the same way as they had been before. And so, dear friends, this is a thumbnail sketch of the Roman ghetto and of the trials and tribulations that it went through. I invite you to read more. There's very, very much more to read. And when I come back, we will talk with the next session. We will talk about life within the ghetto. How did the Jews treat each other? How did Jews treat women? How did Jews treat people who made false accusations? And we will do it on the basis of the documents of the Roman notaries that I mentioned earlier on. Thank you.